Welcome back, everyone. It's episode 2 of our new season, and I'm here with my dear former student, Victoria Bush, who's an SOM alum, and she took this course that I'm teaching now, Public Health Entrepreneurship and Intrapreneurship, 2.5 years ago, and then came back today as a guest speaker to talk about her framework that she created that kind of came out of that course. So I'm so excited to share it with you all. Victoria, welcome. It's been such a treat to have you here today.
I've loved getting to be back, getting to spend time with you, getting to meet the students. It's been so
You're
wonderful.
a natural. You were amazing in the classroom, and I'm so excited to share your work with our listeners and with a broader audience, because I think that it can really impact so many people, because you developed this framework on intrapreneurship, which I'll ask you to go to in a moment. But as you were speaking today, I was thinking, like, there's this mental barrier that many people have against innovating. Like, they think they have to have this grand idea, but your approach, which I won't like ruin, like I'll let you share it, but I think it will help people realize that it doesn't have to be that. So I guess before you tell us your framework, though, tell us more about the background and how it all came to be and what you've been up to since you graduated 2 years ago.
Is it 2? Yeah, I guess 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Time flies. But yeah, so I guess just, taking your class was the first time I ever heard this word entrepreneurship with an I. And I had at SOM, I took a lot of entrepreneurship classes and loved sort of this spirit of innovation of, how can we build new things? How can we solve problems by sort of creating? And I loved all those classes, had so much fun sort of thinking of concepts and building and prototyping and testing, like in the Startup Founders Practicum. But it was one of those things where, I had this idea that I was really excited about. I had so much fun prototyping it, in my kitchen. And then when it came to like, okay, now how would I actually go about building this into a real company? I kept hitting against this feeling of like, I feel like I'm reinventing the wheel. I feel like, there are people out there doing this, much better than I am. And I had this feeling of like, I wish I could sort of give the idea to somebody who like already has a supply chain in place, already has this, infrastructure in place. And there was something that just, the efficiency in me was like, oh, this, like, I feel like what I'm doing is inefficient. And I think, entrepreneurship is a beautiful thing, like creating something completely from scratch, from zero. But I was like, I wish there was something where, I could have the sort of that system in place and innovate within something that already exists. Like there was something I felt like was missing.
Yeah.
And then when I took your class, that's when I first learned about this term entrepreneurship with an I, and I like fell in love with this concept. I thought like this is exactly sort of the sentiment that I was looking for. This idea of, having an entrepreneurial spirit, but within an existing organization.
Exactly.
And so I got super interested in it. And it also, being at SOM, most of us, when we graduate, we go work for an existing company. And so I thought, this is a skill that I want to build. Like I want to become better at internal innovation in the same way that like we learn entrepreneurship principles and skill sets and things like that. I thought, I want to learn those skills, but to innovate within an existing
There's so many courses and resources for entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
But given the fact that the minority of people will not start a new company, they'll get a job in an existing company, there's relatively fewer resources for entrepreneurship.
Exactly. And that's how I was like, this is such a cool thing. And it's something that we all will do, in our lifetimes.
I hope so.
And like, even if it's not in your work organization, let's say it's, in your, a local nonprofit that you volunteer with,
or your kid's
your
school.
religious organization.
Yeah.
Your kid's school. Like all these places are organizations that you're a part of and can sort of contribute to in this sort of entrepreneurial spirit. And so that's what I just got really excited about. And so I started, doing research on, what are people saying about entrepreneurship, what research has been done, and then just like pulling together my own experiences, finding little ways to innovate, within things I was a part of already. And so that's how the framework sort of came to be, like the initial version of it. And then, as I, after graduation, working in startups, that framework has sort of evolved based on my experiences with innovating there. And especially because innovation within an existing organization looks so different from just, starting something from zero. And so that's why it felt like, I wanted to sort of learn this very specific skill that felt separate from sort of the entrepreneurship skills that I had learned in, things like Startup Founders Practicum.
And it's really interesting that actually when you wrote an entrepreneurship framework straight out of grad school, and then I had it in mind like, oh, that's what you're going to teach. And then having been out there and worked in not one, but 2 startups since graduating with Inbox Health and August Schools, you kind of iterated the framework to reflect what you've learned being an innovator within these existing institutions and came back with this beautiful 3 C's of entrepreneurship, which I love. So are you ready to share it?
Yes.
All right, let's hear it.
So the 3 C's, in classic business school fashion,
yeah, exactly.
You have to have
it has to be
3 or 4 of a certain letter. So it's the first C is constrain, second is create, and lastly champion. And it sort of reflects to me sort of the difference between, or sort of the unique challenges of innovating within an existing system. And so to start with constrain, I think what I think of as like the most important first step is sort of understanding what are your constraints within this organization. Every organization has constraints, from giant global corporations to like, early stage startup. The constraints just look different. And so I think sort of that first step is just acknowledging and really understanding what are the constraints that you're up against. And it's so funny. I was talking to a school counselor the other day, and I was sharing about this framework, and she was like it's sort of similar to like what you talk about in therapy about like identifying what is within your control, what you have control over, and what's outside of your control, and realizing that like there are things you can't change, and so by acknowledging those, you can focus on the things that you can, which I loved. So, it applies in lots of different contexts.
Yeah.
But to me, that first C is just sort of like that critical first step before you can ever jump into a solution, just sort of sitting with the problem, relishing in the constraints. And I sort of think of it as, before you can think outside the box, you have to understand the box that you're in. So, what size is the box? What color is the box? What is the box made of? And like, it's going to look so different in each person's organization, whether it's, limitations on resources, time, energy, money. Is it sort of the culture within the organization? Is it, your leadership's priorities? What do they consider important? And so I see that first step as sort of like, understanding, sort of defining that friction, that problem that you want to tackle, and then, understanding the constraints. What have people tried and done, unsuccessfully? What constraints are you facing? Who are the stakeholders involved? Who does this issue affect?
Yeah.
Who could be an ally? Who could be a blocker? And sort of starting to map that out so that sort of like the ecosystem that you're working within.
And you did this great exercise in class with the ducks. I love that with the Lego.
Yes. So I'm a huge Lego fan. And so this was a sort of a really fun activity just to sort of illustrate the fact that constraints aren't necessarily sort of blockers, that constraints can actually sort of drive innovation and drive imagination and creativity in a lot of ways. And so it's an exercise that's used in sort of like Lego professional development workshops.
I love that.
And basically, a group of people, any number of people, are given 6 Lego blocks. It's like 2 red blocks, 4 yellow blocks, in sort of a variety. One of the blocks has a little eye on it. And the task that you give people is to build a duck. And you try to get people who are like sitting next to each other so they don't see each other's work. And inevitably, every single time, people, you think like, oh, there's, sort of one way to build a duck with a certain amount of blocks. Like, you have 6 blocks, that's your constraint. But inevitably, you never get the same duck. Every single person builds a wildly different duck. And to me, that's sort of like the beauty of it, is that these constraints, even though you constraints has sort of a negative connotation, that it's like, if anything, it's a driver of like imagination and creativity. And that like when you're given sort of limited resources, it sort of forces you to be more creative than you would have to be like otherwise. And I think, in the startup context, often you don't have as much funding, and you have to sort of figure out a creative way to do things with fewer resources. And so I love that sort of Lego duck
It was so fun.
activity, because it shows you how
Yeah.
creative you can be with a very limited set of
And I'll
blocks.
comment on the constraints part of the 3Cs framework is that as you're speaking, I'm thinking that, you're applying it to entrepreneurship, to innovating within existing institutions, but one could apply it more broadly to any kind of social change.
Yeah.
As long as you're working with existing institutions, right? Like this spring, I'm going to teach a course on social movements for the first time, and I've been thinking a lot about how we can emerge from social enterprises into social movements, into thinking about like, as we're innovating, like, and for social change, what movement do we need to be part of? What movement do we need to be building? And I keep thinking about like students who are part of a protest or a movement or something, and it's like a lot of the time they don't have a plan. They don't understand the institutions they're working with and how decisions are made, and they don't have a theory of change that's linking their action to the change that they're hoping will happen.
Yeah.
And that's basically part of what you're describing with the
Yeah.
constraints, right? Understanding the stakeholders and the culture and where you're going to meet with resistance and who decides and things like that. So I found that really interesting.
Yeah, and I feel like it helps you sort of preempt future problems. It's like, okay, this is somebody who's maybe going to resist this. What can I do? Whether it's, find a workaround or find some compelling way to sort of, have them see the value of this innovation or movement in that way. And so that's why, like, it's fun to jump to the sort of creation stage of like building something, finding a solution. But especially when you're an entrepreneur and you have to be really realistic and practical and efficient, sort of starting with those constraints is sort of, the path of least resistance.
Yeah, and when we put this into practice at the end of class, you used an expression when advising the students for this part that I loved, and I remember writing it on the board: sit with the problem. So like spend a little bit more time getting to know the problem before you jump into the solution.
Yeah, no, I think, it's easy, it's tempting, and I'm guilty of this myself.
Because we want to
like,
be action oriented.
Yeah,
and we feel
you want to
restless
just like
for
do
change,
it.
but
You
if
want to
you
jump.
want it to be effective, do your research.
Yeah. Time and time again, it's because it's so tempting. You just want to like solve it, and you want to take action, and that's the fun part, is like ideating and coming up with ways to solve the problem. But if there's a lesson I've learned, it's sitting with the problem.
And that's a great segue to the second C, which
Second
is...
C, which is create. And so that's when you get to sort of, once you've identified that friction, you've identified the constraints that you're working within, that's when you get to sort of what I consider the most fun part, is getting to ideate and think of possible solutions. And so here really key is sort of generating ideas that then you can test, you can prototype, you can sort of start with a little pilot program, listen, receive feedback, and then go from there. And so I think especially for entrepreneurs, it's, you always sort of want to like make a big change. You want to like, this isn't working, let's reinvent the whole thing. But when you're, working within an organization, it's not something you can, feasibly do, like overhaul a whole organization overnight. And so I think the key here, and something that, we talked about in class, is just really starting small. Like, it doesn't need to be anything big. It's just, find something that you can do this week, this month, like, not something grand that will take, a ton of levels of approval or, all this stuff. It's sort of, this like incrementalism of like, let me pick one little thing that I can control, that I can make better, and then sort of build momentum that way.
This is the part that I thought would really resonate with people who feel held back by the need to have like the next big idea. And I remember one of the students in class was sharing an example that ties the constraint to the creativity part when you asked like, what are some organizations you've worked with? And she said she used to work in a food bank, and she'd have so many ideas that she wanted to create. And people would say like, well, we might run into compliance issues. And this kind of goes back to the constraint part as much as the create. And she'd be like, great, let's find out what those are. And then maybe we can implement, and we can just like test something small and make it better. And imagine if each person had that attitude where like the world was full of people making small changes in existing institutions. Imagine how much it would add up.
Yeah.
So it's exciting when you frame it in that way, then I think more people will take action.
Yeah. And someone came up after class to chat about basically like, the beauty of entrepreneurship is that you want to spread it around. You want other people to be entrepreneurs. You want everyone to be an entrepreneur. And so I think that's what's so fun about it is like, imagine if everyone thought that way of like, how can I make this better? How can I, like I said at the end of the class, like just always asking that question of how can I leave this better than I found it? I think is that's like the entrepreneur's ethos.
Yeah.
Which I love.
Yeah. Ideally, you want an organization full of entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing.
Okay,
So I guess that takes us to the third C. So constrain, create, and then the last one is champion. And I think this is sort of the one, the most important one. It's the last one because it's often where these things get stuck. You come up with an awesome idea and then you go to try to, implement it, execute on it, and people either say no or, you can't get people to make that change. And sort of at the beginning of the class, I mentioned that, entrepreneurship is really hard and it has its own unique challenges. You're fighting against inertia. It's hard to get people to change the way they do things. Change management is really difficult. And so you're often fighting against sort of this resistance, it's just people have done it that way for a long time.
Inertia.
Exactly. And so, people will just keep doing it unless pushed by an opposing force. So I think that champion piece is so, so key of, you basically need to become the salesperson for your idea. And I think within that is sort of this idea that like often people coming up with these amazing ideas, they're not senior leadership. They're not the CEO. In a lot of cases, the people who are closest to the problem are the ones coming up with these ideas. And so how can you use sort of soft power in the absence of formal authority to, push your idea along? Especially if you're new to an organization, you don't yet have that sort of credibility. How can you sort of use that soft power and use that sort of the storytelling to really sort of make sure that your idea gets adopted, that people see the value? And something, we talked about in class is that, when you're selling your idea, you could have the most amazing idea in the world. But in order to sort of have other people see how amazing that idea is, you really sort of need to frame it in terms that matter to them. So, if you have this amazing idea, but, the other person doesn't see how it could improve their life or help them achieve their goals, why should they, should they take time out of your day, out of their day, to sort of adopt your innovation or your idea?
Yeah. You gave an example from your work about how you got a few like early adopters to test something that you came up with and then how it got integrated, right? Can you share that?
Yeah. So at August Schools, there was this basically this software that I'd found that I thought was really cool, and it basically supports the sales process. It's
Tell us real quick what August Schools does.
Oh,
I
yes.
don't think I asked you.
Yes. So it's a platform for school nurses, school counselors, like K-12 schools that allows them to document meetings with students. So think, if a student comes to talk to the school counselor about, academic anxiety, that's something that they can then record in a secure platform rather than, something like Google Docs.
Yeah. So it's like an electronic health record.
Exactly.
For K-12.
Yes. It's like an EHR for sort of physical and mental health. And then what's really cool is once you start documenting in that more structured way, you can then sort of get insights. You can get analytics out the other side. So one of the favorite parts of my job has just been seeing how schools use that data to then cater their programming in a really thoughtful way. So, being able to see, in our platform, we have charts that show, when there are certain, bump the mic, when there are certain times of year where, let's say there's like a spike in academic anxiety. Okay, so now as a school, let's get to the root cause of that. Let's figure out why that's happening. What can we do in terms of programming to sort of act proactively, do something that, mitigates that and sort of support students before things snowball, which is really cool. So I've loved getting to, hear from these schools and hear how they're using the data to better support their student communities, which has been amazing.
And you got a small number of people in your team, right, to adopt your idea and suggestion.
Yeah, so it was a software that I had found that I thought was really cool. And it was basically sort of a very different way of doing things during the sales process. And it's basically sort of a software that allows you to create almost like a mini custom website for the school that's sort of deciding whether they want to buy the software. And it basically just allows them to sort of continue interacting and engaging with you even when they're not sort of in the meeting. And sort of for education technology, it's, the sales process are a little longer. They're, schools have a certain way of doing things, and you often have to get approval from many different people, and so it's just a cool way to be able to sort of continue that engagement even when you're not, let's say, like on a Zoom call with them, which was cool. And so we were able to basically like have a couple people try it out and, see if this was something that they liked. We started, we tried it for one school and it went really well. And so then we were able to, continue using it, which was really fun. And it's been a really helpful tool. And so, it wasn't something I created, but like, it was fun to get to bring it in and sort of trial it, get feedback on, okay, how can we modify this to better serve the needs of the schools evaluating the product. And we keep iterating it to this day of, adding content, removing this, adding that, what's successful, what's working. And so that was sort of a fun example of like, okay, how can we make this process better, not just for our team, but for, the schools that are evaluating whether or not to buy the software.
I think you really are an entrepreneur by nature. I mean, every institution you're part of, you add so much to it. Even here as a student at SOM, like we just ran into someone from Student Affairs and they were like, oh, and Victoria started this contest and this production and this tradition and this show, right? I think one of them was also related to Lego. There's so many Lego examples.
I do love Lego. Yes, one of the two I feel like proudest things I'm most proud of from SOM are the Lego Build Championship, which was so fun, where we basically had the different cohorts compete to do a Lego build, and we had professors as the judges and, assign a winner, which was just really fun to see all these, people in their 20s and 30s, like sitting for hours playing with Lego. It just makes your day. But then the other thing was the musical. That was sort of one of the absolute highlights of my time here. Starting like the SOM musical, which I was so happy to run into the guy who's now sort of carrying that torch and doing the musical. He did the musical last year and now this year. So I don't know, it like made me a little emotional hearing like they've made it so much bigger and better than, the first year that we did it.
That's awesome. That's the idea. That's what the third C is about, is that eventually you want it to keep growing without you. Like you're the spark that gets it going and then it gets institutionalized.
And with that sort of like the champion, often you're not the one who's going to get to take it to the finish line. And so that's sort of what I love about entrepreneurship, is that sort of a lot of that ego is removed from it, where like your goal is just to make this thing better. And it doesn't mean that you're the one making it better. Often it means like you plant the seed and then somebody else carries it on, which is sort of cool to hear a lot of the examples today in class where people said, like I'm graduating in the spring, like I'm not going to get to sort of finish this work, but like I want to start it and then in a way that it can be carried on in the future.
Exactly. Like recognize the need, get something started. One thing that came up today in class when we were talking about the 3 C's of entrepreneurship is the role that the workplace itself can play and how to intentionally foster a culture of entrepreneurship, and how innovation needs time that's allocated and needs resources and needs like a different rewards and incentive system where like experimenting is good and failing is good instead of just, same thing, different day.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on what workplaces can do to foster that culture of innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just like making space for it. And I mean, even today, the in-class activity we did was, people got into groups with others who are within their same organization. And so inevitably in this class, it was, we're all SOM students, or we're all School of Public Health students, we're all Jackson students. And then that's the organization that you're sort of innovating within. And I think even just having an opportunity, just having like time set aside to say, what's an issue that we can solve?
Yeah.
Like, what's something that's this little friction, something that's like, we know it could be better, but just like, we're going to take a second, like, we're going to take a beat to acknowledge it and then think about what we can do. And like, that in-class activity was, maybe 30 minutes max. And yet, I think people came up with these amazing ideas that I hope that they,
I hope so too,
go and
yeah.
continue to do, because it just felt like, even just in 30 minutes, you could come up with all these amazing ideas for improving the organization that you're in. And so I think just making space, making time for those sorts of, taking a beat, taking a step back and thinking about those things is already like a huge first step.
Yeah, and I do think that you need leadership or at least administration that wants people to innovate and wants to see them through. Another great example you gave was from Adobe, and I love
Yeah.
how they're not just open to innovation, but they're catalyzing it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Adobe Kickbox is what they call it. It's, I think it's genius. I think it's such a great example of sort of the 3 C's put into practice. Because basically, in this case study, Adobe had realized that, all these people, sort of on the ground employees, had these amazing ideas, but they kept getting stuck because the first step was to go pitch it to management. And so they thought, okay, how can we sort of remove that barrier, like remove that roadblock? And so they're these sort of, they look, I don't know, they're not that big. They're like 8.5 by 11 or something, red boxes called kick boxes that as soon as you have an idea, if you're an employee at Adobe, as soon as you have an idea, you can request one of these kick boxes. And the kick box contains, I think it's like a bar of chocolate, a Starbucks gift card, some Post-it notes, and then an $1,000 gift card, or not gift card, like a $1,000 prepaid credit card to basically use to prototype, to test out your idea, create something. And so I love it because, a lot of companies say, oh, we're innovative. We want people to innovate, but they really just put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah.
They say, if we care about innovation, we need to give people the resources to do that. And so I love that sort of acknowledgement that like, okay, we have this roadblock to innovation, which is that like people, in order to get money to do stuff, they have to go pitch it to management. And so all these amazing ideas are getting lost. They're just sort of dead in the water.
Yeah.
And so by having the Kickbox, people are basically able to create something, build something, prototype, and only once they've gone through that whole process, then pitch it to leadership, which is just so cool. So it's just sort of like reframing that approach. And I think it's just like a beautiful way to incentivize idea generation and just sort of testing.
Yeah, and I don't think you have to be a tech giant to do that. I think public sector institutions can do that as well and need to do that as well. There was a study by Jacobson et al. Many years ago, I think it was 2015, and they surveyed public health government workers. And they wanted to innovate and they wanted to be entrepreneurial, but they weren't explicitly given the time and the budget to do that. And they weren't working in an institution that rewarded risk and failure, because to experiment, you have to fail. It's part of it. And so the incentive was to just keep the status quo, right? Because you'll get fired if you experiment and fail instead of being rewarded to do that. So there does need to be an intentional strategy at the highest levels to create an environment where not only where people have the time and budget to innovate, but where you also as the leadership have allocated time and budget to implement and pilot and scale those innovations. Like I think it's really intentional, and also to build the skills for entrepreneurship, like what you did today in class.
Yeah, because even just like learning those skills, I think it's just like having that framework in your head while it's like, oh, I have an idea, or I'm seeing a problem that I think could be better. It just helps you sort of think through it and think through, how can I actually bring this to fruition?
Yeah. So thanks so much for sharing this framework with us. I
course.
really think that anyone can apply it, whether in a business setting or in a civic society setting, or in an academic setting like we did today. Anything else you want to add? Any closing thoughts about the framework or entrepreneurship in general?
Oh, I mean, in terms of closing thoughts, I think I think the sort of the spirit behind entrepreneurship is just like wanting to improve things, wanting to leave things better than you found them. And I think, I always think back to going on field trips to like a park or something, where the teacher would always say, like, if you see litter, pick it up, leave it better than you found it. But I think just having that, and that was sort of like my final message to the class, is just like, constantly asking yourself, how can I leave this better than I found it? And whether it's, in a work setting or, just in life, in your interactions with people, how can I leave this better than I found it? How can I help this person? I think that sort of thinking is what really just drives innovation. It's what like drives that sort of entrepreneurship with an I. So yeah, that's the, sort of the final note I would end on, is just sort of that question, how can I leave this better than I found it?
I think that's the perfect note to end on. And even zooming back away from institutions and entrepreneurship, just life. Like, how can we leave this earth, this society, this family, this job, just this world a little bit better than when we came into it? I think if each person is asking that question as they're living, it will make such a huge difference.
Yeah, and there's no problem too small.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're just picking up a piece of litter. It's still leaving it better than you found it.
Thank you so much, Victoria. You're truly an inspiration. And I can't wait to see what you end up doing over your career as you make each place you're in a little bit better than you found it. And I hope you'll continue to come back and share it with us.
Yeah.